Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for the week of December 2nd, 2023. We commence today's Fund Drive program with our sister Zioni and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, our brother Billion Godson with Africa Town Coalition and Black Shin 365 joins us with an update and message about emergency assistance needed in Africa Town, Leimert Park, and throughout Black Los Angeles. He details the needs and demands for this 23-24 winter season, as it's here impacting the homelessness crisis and how Wells Fargo Bank is still trying to hush the community, today especially with $50 on December 2nd as we speak. We will not be silenced. Your voices matter. All power to the people. This Fund Drive Hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers, Director of Graduate Studies and Associate Professor of History and Gender Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington, here to discuss her book, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. Our music clip mix includes MOK, Zap Mama, Christian McBride, Slide Hampton, Hugh Masekela, Tim Hagarty, Freddie Hubbard, and more. Dr. Horne is about to tell you what our premiums are for this hour for this fund drive. Please call in to donate. The number to call is 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or you can donate online at kpfk.org. So sit back, phone a friend, phone in to pledge, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses. I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear, and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by U.S. imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 and receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org.
They say it is only when they begin their history in their state of freedom that they can come to properly understand their role. Thus, all Africans in America who begin their history in 1619 can never solve the problems they face. Those truly seeking to solve their people's problems must begin their history in Africa.
Alafia, this is your sister Zaini with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, where every day is History Day. So as long as every day we are oppressed as Africans. December 5th, 1958, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, the anti-colonial leader and first prime minister of Ghana, convened the All-African People's Conference. This conference was the first post-slavery, post-colonial conference of independent African nations, fulfilling Nkrumah's inaugural pledge that independence of Ghana means nothing as long as African people anywhere were oppressed. The conference objective was to globally coordinate the decolonization and de-neo-colonialization of African and African people worldwide and the building of a United States of Africa. Within a 10-year period, over 70% of African countries gained independence from colonialism. Today, we are struggling with neo-colonialism, whose graveyard will be in Africa. December 6, 1961. Frantz Fanon, Pan-Africanist, Caribbean-born, French-educated staff psychologist for the French Colonial Army, Division of Interrogation in Algeria, dies. Frantz Fanon commits class suicide and becomes a member of the National Liberation Front of Algeria, with a prolific writer on the psychology of colonialism. His most famous book was The Wretched of the Earth, becomes the Bible of psychology of the oppressed and oppressor, as well as Black Skins, White Masks, which unmasks the cultural vampire nature of European colonial culture. December 6, 1919, Melchora Aquino, revolutionary Filipino independence activist, crosses over. She was imprisoned for providing weapons, storage, and communications to the anti-Spanish resistance forces seeking to gain Filipino independence. December 7th, 1980, Libya, under the revolutionary leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, nationalizes the former British oil fields, setting into motion the de-neocolonialization of Libya and joins the rank of truly independent African nations, free not only from political control, but from European capitalist economic control. A North African country that is in the vanguard of Pan-Africanism and the African Union. December 9th, 1961. Tanganyika gains independence under Mwalimu Nyerere under the banner of Ujamaa socialism, thereby uniting the African island of Zanzibar, creating a nation of Tanzania. The Arusha Declaration was Tanzania's political declaration of building socialism based on the agricultural commune system. December 11th, 1895. Dolores Lowry, nicknamed the La Pasionera, better to die on your feet than on your knees. She was the most famous Spanish freedom fighter and a communist who fought against the capitalist fascist dictator Franco in the Spanish Civil War. December 10th, 1956. Movement for the Liberation of Angola is founded and leads the people of Angola to liberation after 400 plus years of Portuguese colonialism. Angola's MPLA fought the racist regime of South Africa, Rhodesia, and Portugal, all backed by the United States to build a socialist independent Angola. The Latin American country of Cuba provides military support in a spirit of internationalism to assist Angola in defeating South African and Western imperialism through direct military defeat of the combined white forces and their Uncle Tom, Jonas, Savimbi, and UNITA. This has been Sister Ziny with our revolutionary African drumbeat historical calendar here at KPFK 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. We want to praise up our revolutionary ancestors who have made our present existence possible by hailing up the words of our Tanzanian brothers and sisters. Power to the people. Amandala.
Away too.
Amandala.
Away too.
Amandala.
Away too.
Yo, black magic, you know how we still here? After all they did to kill us and try to get rid of us, they hung us, they did everything you could imagine, and we still here. Yo, 400 years, tears burn like acid. A lot of us died with fight and no casket. Still multiplying, came back with passion. The scheme you devised didn't work, it's black magic. Tried to sweep it under the rug and move past it. Hide the truth and tell lies to the masses. Praying for years and fear now.
This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now, and with us on the line is our brother Billion with Africa Town Coalition and Black Shin 365. How are you doing this morning, Billion?
And I'm great. How you doing, Tej? Thank you for welcoming us back to the studio.
Right on. We're doing all right. But we wanted to get an update from you on the emergency assistance that's needed in Africa Town, Leimert Park area, and throughout Black Los Angeles. And if you can tell us what's going on and what is needed, and let our listeners know.
Yes, greetings, Freedom Now family. As a lot of you see throughout the city, the housing crisis is getting worse as we hear a lot of talk about the things that are being done for the effort to house people. We know for whatever reason, a number of Black people especially are being missed out. Last Sunday, the Africa Town Village witnessed a brother reach his breaking point and actually put a gun to his head in an attempt to take his life. Fortunately, one of our members and another community member was able to wrestle the gun out of his hands and prevent anyone from getting harmed. But in addition to that, we're hearing a number of young people express how they no longer want to live, and we've been having to advocate hard for people who are just really being left out here on the streets to die, especially as the temperatures are getting colder. Based on our observation, we put together what we're calling an emergency assistance list for Africa Town and Black LA in general, which includes providing housing for Black Angelenos who are being missed by existing programs, provide property owners with assistance to prevent them from having to increase rents, provide media support to the continued plight of Black people here in this city, invest funds into Black-led organizations who can bring about workforce development and give people jobs to where they can afford a living here in this city, expedite the release of Black inmates who are still being held on enhancements, which for 3 years now we've been told people on enhancement will be released. Provide resources for the Sunday African Marketplace and Drum Circle, which a number of Black street merchants are now coming to as a means to generate income. Cease funding construction projects throughout the city that have failed to hire or sustain Black laborers and contractors. Provide Project 43 right here in the Hyde Park community with funding for their homeless and community market programs. Provide funding for other Black auras such as BLMLA, Downtown Crenshaw, LA Crop Swap, the Lion Arts Gallery, who are bringing healthy food options into our communities. Provide grants for the African Village Vendors Association and other Black street vendors. Provide businesses in LA with funding to provide jobs for Black people who are unemployed or being given below living wage jobs. Expedite the licensing to Black social equity applicants, and sanction the banks that continue to usurp Black wealth. And with this in particular, today, Congresswoman Maxine Waters is holding a town hall to hold banks accountable, but she expressed a few days ago that in response, Wells Fargo, instead of going to her town hall to address what they're doing, they're having a simultaneous event right now in Africatown, and they're offering people $50 to come start accounts at that bank. But we intend to not allow that event to go forward. Also, provide Black Angelenos with tax breaks, provide Black Angelenos with free medical care, provide Black students with assistance, be it food, books, transportation, provide space for Africatown Enterprise to operate programs that are catered to the needs of our community, provide funding for healers in our community. We know right now a lot of people just in general are suffering trauma, but especially those who are unhoused and again just don't have the resources to pay for the healers. So we need assistance for healers to do necessary work in our community. Designate our village as an official historic tourism zone by the name of Africatown, which we know will generate millions of dollars and bringing people into our community. Void the discriminatory sale of the Baldwin Hills Crenshaw Plaza to David Schwartzman that took place a few years ago. And we're asking all officials to make a public commitment to the push for reparations for Black people. And we're asking that they cease funding and resources for our community to the same group of newcomers who were pretty much appointed by the former council member Mark Ridley Thomas, who has been indicted. But these newcomers pretty much move forward in his same capacity of being abusive, unprincipled, and untrustworthy. But yet, these are the ones who all these entities are giving resources for our community to, and in turn, our community is not receiving a fair or equitable share of those resources.
So we wanted to thank you, Brother Billion, for all of your work in Africatown and throughout Black Los Angeles. We salute you, and we look forward to an update soon.
And I thank you all for continuing the tradition that our great brother Didon Kamathi brought forward and keeping freedom now alive.
Yo, mentally enslaved us and gave us a savior. Problem is, nobody didn't save us. Millions of brothers and sisters annihilated, violated, decapitated.
My name's Kenneth Lee Zambarone, calling in from Wabash Valley Correctional Facility in Carlisle, Indiana. This piece is regarding a friend that committed suicide today. Today at around 11 a.m., my friend, Curtis McGahey, committed suicide. I'd known Kurt for nearly 10 years. He was witty and playful, He would playfully call me Mexi Whitey because he said I was the tallest white Mexican he ever met. Kurt loved to joke and loved talking crap on the handball, basketball, and baseball court. Kurt truly loved baseball and was a fanatic. Kurt was proud that he was in the military and talked about what he learned in the Army and all of his experiences and how he could kick my ass because of his experiences. Kurt and I bonded over open conversations of surviving childhood traumas. Kurt wasn't perfect, but his imperfections had a past. I am angry because people stated that Kurt went to the medical department on Thanksgiving Day seeking a consultation with a therapist and was told that there was none at the prison. Kurt was then sent back to his cell on red tag, which means that Kurt had to spend the whole holiday weekend on 24 hours a day lockdown. Kurt had a cellie, but today his cellie left for work. Kurt was alone in that cell, and he hung himself. I once read a quote that love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. I wish the medical department, the prison, or a guard would have shown him some compassion. I think he could have survived.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear, and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Amrita Chakrabarti Myers, Ruth N. Halls, Associate Professor of History and Gender Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington, and author of the book, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Myers.
Thank you, Dr. Horne, for inviting me. It's truly my pleasure.
No, I assure you, it's our pleasure. So, who was Julia Chinn, and why did you decide to write a book about her?
Well, Julia was an enslaved woman who lived in Kentucky. She was born sometime in the 1790s, and she died in a cholera epidemic in 1833. And for about almost 25 years of her life, she was in a sexual relationship with a man named Richard Mentor Johnson, who was a plantation owner, a slaveholder, a lawyer, and for 45 years of his life, a politician at the state and federal levels. And for one term, he was Vice President of the United States under Martin Van Buren. And the thing is that even though this is a very powerful, prominent family in Kentucky, the Johnsons, and even though this is a very important relationship, right? Julia and Richard's relationship is very public, it's very open, it's not hidden in the slave quarters. Johnson never has a white wife. He refers to Julia as his wife. He acknowledges their two daughters as his. And they live together as a family, but this is not, Julia and her daughters have never been written about in any sustained way. There's been no historically, archivally written and researched books or articles about Julia or her daughters up until this moment. And so when I ran across a small mention of her in a survey textbook many years ago, because really they were talking about Johnson, but she was brought up in the context of that small paragraph, I immediately thought to myself, who is this woman and why have I never heard of her? And admittedly, I wondered why I had never heard of Richard Johnson either, even though I'm a 19th century US historian. And so I did a little digging and came to discover that the last time anyone had written even a biography of Richard had been back in 1932. And the only thing really about Julia circulating on the internet were some pretty, what I would say voyeuristic pieces that, referred to her as a concubine and things like that. Again, nothing really archivally researched or written. And so I thought, well, this is a woman who deserves to have her story told. We deserve to know more about her daughters, about their life in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky. This isn't Charleston, this isn't New Orleans, but this is a important, interracial, partnership, with a very important politician. And so we need to know, what are their lives like? What power and privileges do they have? What do they not have? Where can they not go? Where are the lines drawn in the community and nationally? And that's really what started me down the path to trying to uncover Julia's story and bring it to the world.
So Richard Johnson was not the only leading U.S. politician who consorted with a Black woman. Many in our audience may be familiar with Thomas Jefferson, given credit for the Declaration of Independence, the third U.S. president, and his, quote, relationship, unquote, with Sally Hemings, a woman of color. How would you compare these two liaisons?
A lot of people, when I start talking about Julia and Richard, bring up the Jefferson-Hemings relationship, and understandably so, because both Jefferson and Johnson are politicians. One becomes a president, the other a vice president. Both are, plantation holders, slave owners, extremely wealthy and powerful. And they're actually chronologically also contemporaries in many ways. What's different about these relationships is that Thomas Jefferson never publicly acknowledged his relationship with Sally Hemings. The pair did not openly live together at Monticello. Even though everyone sort of knew about their relationship and sort of it was pillow talk, and chatted about it, or wrote sort of tongue-in-cheek satirical newspaper articles about it, Jefferson never came out and said, "This is my wife, this is my partner." He never had, he didn't acknowledge their children, and none of the family members were freed until after Jefferson had died. Richard Johnson, on the other hand, is very public in his relationship with Julia. As I mentioned before, the pair lived together at Blue Spring Farm, which is his plantation. They have 2 daughters together, Adeline and Imogene, who carry Johnson's last name and are, educated and give, good marriages are arranged for them when they come of age. Richard gives them enslaved laborers, vast plantation property, gifts of cash throughout the course of his life, and to their children as well. Julia entertains at Blue Spring Farm. She oversees visits by people like the Marquis de Lafayette and former presidents who come to visit. She's known as the hostess, the mistress of Blue Spring Farm. And so she has a life that's very different than Sally Hemings, because Sally and Thomas's relationship is always in the shadows and it's never confirmed. Whereas Richard and Julia's relationship is very public. Everyone knows that she's his sexual partner, his wife, his mistress. They have different names for her. When he's in DC for 6 months of every year as a congressman, a senator, vice president, it's Julia and then their grown daughters who will run the plantation, run the businesses, the taverns, the hotels. She has access to the lines of credit, cash. She helps pay employees. She oversees the enslaved labor force. So it's a very, very different relationship from the one that Hemings and Jefferson have in terms of the public nature of it and Julia's sort of headship and authority over Blue Spring when Richard is not at home.
Now, my understanding is that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings began their relationship when she was a teenager, if I'm not mistaken. I assume that Julia Chinn was an adult woman when she began her relationship with Richard Johnson. Is that accurate?
Well, we don't have Julia's exact date of birth. We know she died in 1833 because that was recorded in the church parish register books of the church that she and Richard and the girls attended, Great Crossing Baptist Church, which was it was actually founded by Richard's parents and just a couple of miles down the road from where the family lived. Her date of birth is unclear. It's sometime in the 1790s. There's 2 sets of oral traditions. One set says that she was born in 1790, which means that when she began her relationship with Richard in 1810, she would have been 20 years old. The other set of oral data, which comes from former enslaved laborers of the family, state that Julia was only 14 or 15 when she had her first daughter, Imogene. Imogene was born in 1811. So counting backwards, that means that Julia would have been born in 1796 or 1797. Richard was born in 1780. So at the best, we're looking at a 10-year gap if she was born in 1790 and he was born in 1780. At its largest, if she was born in 1797, that means that the gap between the two would have been 17 years. And when the relationship started, if that was the case, she would have been 13 or 14, and he at that point was 30 years old.
Now, this Jefferson and Johnson situation is not unique. For example, you talk about Henry Clay, another leading politician in Washington, D.C. What do you have to say about him? How does he figure into your book?
Well, Clay and Johnson are, they're both from Kentucky. They're both prominent statesmen, right, and politicians. They come of political age at the same time. They're young, rising politicians who become war hawks and vote in favor of the War of 1812. Richard actually will fight in the War of 1812. So they are chronological contemporaries. They are neighborhood contemporaries because they live not far from one another in Kentucky. They're both wealthy. They're both plantation holders and slave owners. And in addition to that, Henry Clay has a number of relationships with enslaved women on his plantation. He has, what the difference is that Clay has a white wife. He's quote unquote properly married to a white woman and has a white family, but he has a succession of enslaved women who he has sexual relationships with, who he keeps in the quarters. So he does not publicly acknowledge these relationships, but people know about them. They gossip about them and talk about them. And one of these young women had several children by Clay. And there's a letter at the Filson Archives in Louisville, Kentucky, that states that, Henry Clay's wife actually caught him with this young woman in the quarters, in a rather, personal, embrace. And she was furious because she caught him basically with his pants down, right? And it caused a lot of problems in their marriage. And so in order to keep the peace, Clay sold his mistress and their children, his biracial children, downriver to Louisiana to keep the peace and get rid of the evidence, so to speak. And the letter writer said, at least Johnson, never sold his flesh and blood, never sold his children downriver. Say what you want to about him. You might not like the fact that he's in this relationship with Julia and has these children by her, but he's at least done right by his children and by his family. He's never sold them or abandoned them. He's raised them, taken care of them, educated them. They said, how can you compare him to someone like Henry Clay? How can the Whigs say that they would want to vote for a man like Clay because he's supposedly an abolitionist or anti-slavery, believes in, supposedly racial justice? They're like, that's it. They said basically, this is hypocrisy.
And Henry Clay was a serious contender for the White House, if I'm not mistaken.
He was more than once. He was vice president more than once, and he ran for the presidency a number of times and failed to acquire the top office. But he was, probably, I would say, one of the 2 or 3 most important statesmen of the antebellum period. I mean, when I think of the 19th century, you think of, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. You think of Henry Clay from Kentucky because he authored the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which helped save the Union at that point. But then he also puts together the Compromise of 1850 shortly before his death, which saves the country once again for a few more years. And really, other than Calhoun and Clay, you have Thomas Jefferson and really Daniel Webster. So there's a handful of really sort of power brokers of the 19th century, and Clay is absolutely among them.
Now, George Poindexter would not be amongst them, but he figures into your pages as well. How so?
No, and most people would have never heard of George Poindexter. He's also a 19th century politician. He's also a lawyer. He's a judge. He's from Mississippi. He ends up serving in a number of different positions in Congress, U.S. representative, as well as a U.S. senator. But he's also governor of Mississippi from 1820 to 1822. And the reason Poindexter figures into my book is because he's also someone who, a white male politician who has a relationship with an enslaved Black woman. And what Poindexter does is he actually he's pretty kind of open about his relationship. He doesn't necessarily refer to this woman as his wife, like Richard calls Julia his wife very openly more than once. But Poindexter travels to Kentucky for vacation one year, and he brings his enslaved Black, partner with him. And he doesn't tell the owner of the landlady of the hotel that he's staying at who he's coming with. She assumes he's coming by himself or with his wife. And then she basically realizes that he's there with, a Black woman who's his enslaved mistress. And she kicks George and the lady out of her establishment because she says this is a decent Christian establishment, right? You're not going to carry on like this here with a Black woman. And so she kicks George and this unnamed woman out of her establishment. She also throws the bed out of the room into the weeds and leaves it to rot because as far as she's concerned, it's now been defiled by, interracial sex and by a Black woman's body and can no longer be used again. And this is a story that's actually published in dozens of newspapers around the country.
Thank you, Dr. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers, and thank you, Dr. Gerald Horne. As we are in Fund Drive this hour, for our listeners, if you are enjoying this conversation with the scholarship of Dr. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers, as well as other programs where Dr. Horne has taken his time to interview scholars from all over the world, please support us here at Freedom Now this hour. We need your support. Dr. Horne is going to tell us right now what you can get with your donation this hour before we turn to the rest of this interview. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 and receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Professor Myers, Ruth N. Halls, Associate Professor of History and Gender Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington, author of the book, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. What are anti-sumptuary laws, and how do they figure into your book?
So anti-sumptuary laws are fairly common not only throughout portions of the United States where slavery is legal in the 19th century, but actually throughout the African diasporic world where slavery was common, including in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And it basically they're laws which prohibit Black people, even if they're free, from wearing certain kinds of clothing that make them look too good, basically. Laws that prohibit them from wearing silks or satins, from wearing gold jewelry, laws that prohibit Black women from wearing their hair up, because that's a sign of class, of being a lady. So all of these anti-sumptuary laws are meant to make Black people, particularly free Black people, dress a certain way so that their station in life is more easily marked. Because the United States is a country that, tried to say, well, free equals white, slave equals Black, and Black equals slave. But what happens when you have free Black people and they are working, earning money, buying homes, sending their children to school, and they're dressing like white people? How do you know if they're enslaved or free in a city like Charleston or New Orleans? So those are cities in the US in particular that pass these anti-sumptuary laws, and they're really targeted at free Black women who they feel are becoming uppity in how they dress. They're trying to compete with ladies, and who do they think they are? This figures into my story in particular because Julia and her daughters are known for being beautifully dressed in gorgeous dresses that Julia either sews herself or that she professionally purchases or has made for them. And so the local newspapers write a lot about the Johnson women's clothing, and that it makes them uncomfortable that they dress better than a lot of poor white people in the community. And so the lines of class and status and power are being blurred by Julia, her nieces, her daughters, because they are educated, they're all literate, they go to church, they wear beautiful clothes, they entertain powerful white people at their home. And all of these things make a lot of people uncomfortable. They also ride around in the family carriage. And again, riding in carriages was meant for white people of a certain class. So there are no specific anti-sumptuary laws in Kentucky. When we think about, there were enslaved people, men and women, who may have had a little bit more opportunity, a few more privileges, depending on always the type of relationship they were able to forge with their owners. Whether it was because they had skills and were artisans or craftsmen or trade people, because perhaps they became valets or body servants, perhaps they worked in the house. But it's a double-edged sword, because as much as there's privilege on the one side, there's always limitations and, fear and threats on the other side, because this is always an unequal relationship. There's always an imbalance in terms of the power. And the enslaved person in question knows that if they don't keep their benefactor, their owner, their master happy, that enslaver can sell them beat them, kill them, sell their family away from them. All kinds of things can happen to them. And so this is the kind of position that Julia Chinn finds herself in, like Sally Hemings and others that I write about in my book. I think of Anna Kingsley, right, in Florida. These are women who are, from a very young age, 13, 14, 15, are brought into sexual relationships with much older white men. And as a result of that, they are able to acquire usually privilege and power much more so for their children and grandchildren than they really ever are for themselves. So you see Julia Chinn, who dies enslaved, but both of her daughters are free women. Julia never has a formal education, although she is literate, but both of her daughters are formally educated, and incredibly well so in Latin and mathematics, and very, very intelligent, very well read, because they had the opportunity to be educated. Julia dies without any property to her name, but because of her hard work, because of this relationship with Richard, both of her daughters, they marry. Richard and Julia arrange marriages for them to local white men. And because of who their father is, they inherit thousands of acres of Kentucky bluegrass farmland, enslaved laborers, cash, etc. So there's a lot of privilege that comes even more so with being children and grandchildren of powerful white men like this, as opposed to being their partners. Because when you look at the fact that Sally Hemings, right, Julia Chinn, these are women who did not necessarily gain much for themselves, but they gained much more for their children. But there's always that fear that if they step the wrong way, those privileges will end, and because they have to always keep their enslaver happy. But even the small privileges that they receive are constantly being sort of negotiated and pushed back against by other white people, whether it's extended family members, whether it's local folks, whether it's in the national press. So Julia is constantly being smeared in the national press, as well as so are her daughters. There's pushback from local community members about how they dress and, their carriage riding and what parties they can attend. White people are willing to go to Blue Spring Farm and attend parties that the Johnsons host. But when Julia's daughters attempt to go to local functions in town, white people step forward and say, no, you cannot come here. You are Black. That's it. You're done. You're technically enslaved, right? Although the girls were never treated as if they were enslaved. So I think it's a really tricky situation. Julia was taken away from her mother and brought into the senior Johnson household, Richard's parents' household, to be trained as a domestic servant when she was only 6 years old. And then she was taken from their farm altogether and sent to Richard's farm when she was about 13 or 14. So here's a young woman, who's a teenager, a girl who's been taken away from her mom, most of her family members, and then she finds herself faced with this, quote unquote choice, have sex with Richard and potentially use it to make a better life for her children. Or what's the other option? He may have probably raped her, right? Or had sex with her anyway against her will. So she made a choice, and it was, it makes her complicit in many ways in what's happening on the farm, because she's overseeing the enslaved laborers, right? And writing letters to her husband when he's in DC and talking about punishments and things like this. But I often wonder, how much choice or what chance did she have, being removed from her mom at 6 and then shipped off to Richard's farm at 13 or 14. And what I think of people like Harriet Jacobs and others who we know more about, who were faced with similar situations, and it's a no-win scenario in many respects.
So I noticed that the descendants of Julia Chinn, fundamentally, they, quote, passed, unquote, into whiteness. And one branch of that family was the Pence family. I take it that there is no relationship to the former U.S. Vice President.
No, we've never found any connection to former Vice President Mike Pence. It is a question that a lot of people ask me. However, Imogene, the oldest daughter, marries a man named Daniel Pence, and they have 6 children, 4 of whom live to adulthood. And that's where the Pence name comes from, out of Kentucky on that side. But there are other Pences from other parts of the country, including Virginia. And as far as at least up until this point, we've not had any DNA matches that show that Mike Pence belongs to this family.
Finally, Professor Myers, Ruth N. Hall's Associate Professor of History and Gender Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington, author of the book, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. What's next on your research agenda? What do your readers have to look forward to?
It's I'm trying to enjoy the moment because this book just came out last month, and it has been 12 years in the making. So it's been a long process, but I'm also right now doing administrative work because I'm director of graduate studies in my department, and I'm enjoying doing administrative work. But I do have a hint of a seed of a germ of an idea for a 3rd book that I would really like to work on. And it would take me back to South Carolina, which is where my first book is based. And it would mean actually looking at Michelle Robinson Obama's ancestors who hail from South Carolina. So it wouldn't be a biography of Mrs. Obama, but it would be a family study of her enslaved ancestors in South Carolina, and making that connection of, how this family goes from being enslaved in South Carolina to ultimately we end up with a Michelle Robinson Obama who, goes to Ivy League colleges and eventually becomes, the First Lady of the United States. But it's really a book it would be about researching her family as opposed to researching her.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Myers. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you again for having me, Dr. Horne. This was really a pleasure.
Ditto.
And in closing, we'd like to thank everybody who donated this hour. Thank you so much for supporting Freedom Now to stay on the air and keep the lights on in the building at KPFK. We wanted to thank our guest, Dr. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers. Thank you to our brother, Billion Godson. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon. Thank you to our board op, Wendell Handy, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can still be reheard for the next 60 days. You can go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Also, we wanted you to mark your calendars. It is a 2024 event. Dr. Horne will be speaking here in Los Angeles for Black History Month. Saturday, February 3rd, 2024, he'll be speaking here in Leimert Park about his books, I Dare Say, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Mark your calendars, folks. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. Until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.